The City Council Committee of the Whole will meet in person on Tuesday, May 23rd, 2023 at 6 p.m. for the purpose of discussing the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA program, and provide a public update on the work undertaken to date and the plan moving forward to leverage our first round of ARPA funds for a robust recovery from the pandemic. This meeting is being held in City Council Chambers, 93 Washington Street, Salem, Mass., 2nd floor. Individuals may listen, view, or participate remotely in the meeting via a remote participation platform called Zoom through either of the following ways. Click on the link, post it in the agenda, password 436-347, or via telephone 877-853-5257, enter webinar ID 892-5033-7286. Every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access the proceedings in real time via technological means. In the event that we are unable to do so in matters not requiring a public hearing, we will post on the City of Salem's website an audio or video recording, transcript, or other comprehensive record of proceedings as soon as possible after the meeting. Persons requiring auxiliary aids and services for effective communication may request so no later than 2 business days before the meeting to the City of Salem's ADA coordinator. Absent this evening for the Committee of the Whole, Councilor Dominguez, Councilor Watson-Felt, Councilor Presnewski, and Councilor McLean. Joining us this evening from the City of Salem, we have Anna Friedman, the Director of Finance. We have Nick Downing. Nick, I'm sorry, I don't know your new title.
Capital Planning and Federal Funds Manager.
From Capital Planning and Federal Funds Management. And we are here in council chambers to discuss the update on ARPA funding. We just had our annual budget retreat with the acting mayor a couple weeks ago, where we went over some overarching themes of the budget, and a few questions from ARPA came up. So I think this is a good time in between that and then when we really dig into the budget in the next couple of weeks to see where we stand with our ARPA funding and program management. So with that, unless if there are any questions from the committee that we have here in front of us, I think we can just get started with the presentation that Nick has provided. Also for record, so Nick will be presenting this evening, Nick and Anna, and we all have copies in front of us, and it's also available electronically in our drive.
Thank you. My name is Nick Downing. I am the city's federal funds and capital plan manager. I'm going to share my screen here so we can all see this. This should look very familiar to the members of the council. The first few slides especially are just a quick overview of ARPA, but for anyone who might be watching at home, just to get everyone kind of up to speed. So quick general overview on ARPA. The city has received a total of $35 million in ARPA funds, $27 million in our direct municipal allocation, and then an additional $8 million that we got through the diverted funds that would have gone to county government if county government had still existed here. We must obligate and allocate these funds by the end of calendar year 2024, so by December 31st, 2024, and all funds must be expended by the end of calendar year 2026. Eligible uses for the funds include the direct response to the pandemic and recovery from associated economic impacts, certain infrastructure projects, premium pay for certain frontline workers, replacement of municipal revenue and admin costs. Ineligible uses include deposits into pension funds, matching funds for federally funded projects with some important exceptions, and tax offsets. Through FY 2023, the city has programmed just under $31 million through various programs, projects, and initiatives that are currently underway. Our current strategy is to fully reevaluate all those programs the middle of this year, which I'll speak about a little bit later, and potentially look at some reallocations if funds have not been expended. And all the information on funding use and opportunities is regularly posted at salem.com/recovery. So our quarterly reports to the feds are posted there, as are opportunities for new funding programs. Our strategy and initiatives. So early on in the process, we had a public process that councilors were involved in, the public was involved in as well, that kind of set up the general kind of strategy for how we have invested our ARPA dollars. So we have looked at housing programs and initiatives, including the ADU support and grant program, additional investments in actual affordable housing construction, which are some funds that are going to be going out the door relatively soon. Some direct investments for the Salem Affordable Housing Trust Fund, a right of first refusal program, amongst others. We've also looked at sustainability, open space, and food security programs, mobility and programs and initiatives, including support for a study around the South Salem commuter rail project, expansion of Blue Bikes, and financial support for the Salem Skipper Rideshare program. Earlier on in ARPA, when we were still very much in the midst of some of the worst economic impacts of the pandemic, we had our employee retention program, our expanded outdoor dining program, among others, to help our local businesses that we were kind of recovering economically through the pandemic at that time. More recently, we have had our nonprofit equity support and grant program, our mental health access support grant program. Sorry, getting one slide ahead of me there. Our community compact grant matching funds for the equity audit, funding for expanded behavioral health services at the North Shore Community Health Center, and funding for emergency shelter improvements at Hawk. This pie chart here is the kind of dollar breakdown of ARPA allocations as of just about 5 days ago, just last week. Those are kind of the big categories for us. So housing and digital equity, capital and open space, pandemic emergency response reserve, the direct pandemic response and public health costs, administrative costs, economic recovery, transportation, food security, and then other general government spending. So it's important to note that one of the eligible uses for the ARPA funds is what's known as revenue loss. So obviously local receipts for cities and towns and for the state took a hit during the pandemic. So the federal government allows cities and towns to essentially use ARPA funds to spend on anything that local government would be allowed to spend money on anyways. We are limited in the total number of dollars we can use in that category to a total of about $10 million of our $35 million allocation. And because that's the most flexible money, that's the money that we always kind of use that money last. If we want to use money, we try and find an eligibility code within the rules from the feds where we can spend the money under a different code otherwise, because we just want to keep that flexible money, keep as much of it as we can until we get close to the end, so that when we need to spend it a little more readily, we have the flexibility to do so. Some updates on some of the initiatives that we've undertaken, some of the bigger ones. So Salem Skipper received $400,000 in FY23 from ARPA to supplement the operating costs, and then an additional $600,000 in ARPA funds were allocated to make sure that we could extend that service through September. We'll need an RFP to continue services and also align our service with some opportunities coming from the federal government through grants to actually expand Skipper regionally. But we're looking very much at this program because we really need kind of a sustainable and reliable funding source for it. It's a great program that folks have really enjoyed. It is not inexpensive to run, and we need to make sure that we can find a regular and routine sustainable funding source for this, because even though we've got a couple more years on ARPA, ARPA will eventually go away. And to the extent possible, we've been really trying to avoid any of those kind of fiscal cliffs. We don't want to put the city in a tight spot when it comes to the ARPA funds running out, and then all of a sudden we have to scramble to find new local money to kind of infill all of that. One of the things that we've used ARPA for is to fund some aspects of our capital plan as well. Coming up for FY24, some proposed capital projects that we have considered proposing funding via ARPA would be the Kernwood Accessibility and Improvement Project, which would bring ADA compliance to the Kernwood boat ramp, which is currently not ADA compliant at all. Some additional funding for the reconstruction of the Willows Pier, which, as we all know, got entirely destroyed in recent storms. So this would fund the complete design and reconstruction of that project. Funding for Palmer Cove Park Phase 2, and then also additional ARPA funds to rebuild the Witchcraft Heights Playground. So that's one of those projects where ARPA funds are being put together with other existing funds to kind of build a bit of a hodgepodge there, kind of get to the final funding gap, and that's what we've tried to use ARPA for a lot, is to kind of be that kind of fill in the gap at the end, kind of that last mile of funding that projects might need. In terms of kind of some upcoming ARPA process coming forward, as I mentioned earlier, starting July 1st, we're going to look at all of our ARPA allocations that have been made to date. We're going to look at funds that have been expended and those that have not, to kind of get a sense of if there are projects that either are complete and came in under budget, potentially some projects that maybe haven't gotten off the ground yet or a little bit slower than we had hoped they might be. And at that point, that'll give us a better sense of what funds do we have available and what do we need to potentially reallocate in a time that will still make sure that those funds can get expended by the end of the ARPA deadline. We don't want to get caught flat-footed at the end of calendar 2024 and realize that we need to really reobligate things and do it in a rushed manner. And we certainly want to make sure that when we are making those awards, as we get to the end of 2024, that's money that's actually going to get spent and move it out the door, because I think the last thing any of us want to do is leave money on the table. We want to make sure that we're spending this money on projects that we need here in Salem. At that time, that'll also kind of restart our ARPA public engagement process. So we had committed to having 2 public engagement meetings about ARPA annually. We would have had one at the end of 2022, but given the mayoral transitions that were in the works at that time, there weren't really many new ARPA decisions that were necessarily being made after Mayor Driscoll left and before the election. So we felt that it made sense to kind of sit tight until the new administration was in and until we can kind of do our homework here, kind of sharpen our pencils up and figure out what we might actually have to reallocate. And then we'll kind of restart that public engagement process at that time with some better information in terms of, all right, this is the new number of what we have available now, and how do we kind of make the funding decisions that fit within those overall strategies and goals that we set up at the beginning of the process, but now with the new administration.
Thanks, Nick. It's a lot of info.
It's a lot of info. Sorry,
I think we're absorbing it a little.
Yeah.
I'm trying to myself get like a high level recap of all of that was just given us. So essentially, like super high level, 35 million was basically our ARPA bucket.
Right.
We've allocated 30.5 million. How much of that allocated has been spent already?
Spent today as of the last, so we submit our quarterly reports to the feds. The last one was due at the end of April. As of that report, we had spent just over 4 million. It was about, I think it was about 4.2 or 4.3. So that is a pretty significant lag. We have some big projects that have been in the works for a little while where some money is going to be going out the door shortly. So our Affordable Housing Construction Grant Program, that's a total of $5 million in that bucket. Some of that money is going to actually a project at Plummer Youth Promise, and then the rest is going to 3 housing construction programs or housing construction projects. And that has taken a while to get out the door because that's a relatively complicated contracting process to go through. To be giving significant funds for the actual construction of that, we want to make sure that the terms and conditions for those agreements are such that if we get toward the end of the ARPA timeline and funds haven't been expended, that the city can claw that money back and reallocate it as needed. So projects like that had been announced previously, but myself and my colleague Dave Rodriguez, who wasn't able to be here this evening, he's really been kind of the lead on getting those terms and conditions and contracting side of things straightened out. There's often kind of that lag between when a project is announced and when we can actually get the money out the door with some of those bigger projects. We've also seen some projects we hope that there's kind of a little bit more interest going forward. So our ADU program that we started, that is money that allows residents to get funds to both cover the design and the construction of accessory dwelling units. We've had 2 of the design grants come through and 1 construction grant. We allocated about $1 million for that, with each project, if you included design and construction, coming in at just under $50,000. So that's a big bucket of money that we've set aside right now that we haven't fully tapped into. We're hopeful that more folks will be interested in that going forward. And then I think the other, there's a big chunk of money that we put in kind of our pandemic emergency reserve. So early on, when we kind of realized that it was incredibly unlikely that in the event of a significant flare-up in COVID or another kind of mutation of the virus coming down the pike, that it was very unlikely we were going to see more assistance from the state or the feds. So the decision was made to basically take about 10% of our total allocation, so about $3.5 million, and keep that in our pandemic reserve in case there was another flare-up and another major outbreak. That has not been the case to date, and that's one of the buckets of money that we'll look at starting July 1 to see if that number should be reduced and we can start to allocate some of those funds. But that's a significant portion of money that we have not touched at all up to this point because thankfully there has not been another significant outbreak in this time period. But that's one of those buckets of money that we're going to look at and say, all right, how much of that should we continue to maintain and kind of hold harmless, here in 2023 and then into 2024, and where should some of that potentially get reallocated into other new or existing projects?
So is that currently in that pandemic emergency response reserve bucket? That's that bucket?
Yeah, that's that $3.5 million that we have not spent a dime of so far.
Thanks. For the housing digital equity bucket, because that's kind of the largest one of almost 10, and it sounds like there are some big projects that funding is being kind of held for, reserved for. How much of that almost 10 has been spent?
Of that 10, about, doing some quick math, less than 200,000 so far, but about half of that is going to be going out the door soon to the Affordable Housing Construction Grant Program. So it's the Affordable Housing Construction Grant Program, so that is money that is going to 4 projects overall, one of which, again, is some funds we chose to divert to a project at Plummer Youth Promise, and then the other 3 housing projects are, I'm going to forget the particular names of them, but it's at I might look to Anna for information. I know it's funding at the Crescent Lot project is one of them, and the other 2 are right, a project with the North Shore CDC, and then I believe Harbor Light as well. A
logistic question with that. So when you're saying the $5 million is going out for it's actually like spent going out. It's not we're allocating it going out. Like they're taking the money and it's the way that's going to work again, and the reason that it's taken a while is because there's a lot of back and forth with kind of all the involved parties about how we were going to structure actually getting them the money, and how the city could kind of make that direct payment to these organizations. So it took some time back and forth with our legal team and their legal team to land on something that the city felt comfortable with, that we could actually kind of get behind, and that, again, we felt like if we run into an issue where the money isn't being spent by the deadline, we still have that ability to call it back. But those agreements have been sorted out, and we're now going through the process of actually getting those checks cut and spent and out the door. Cool, thank you. Sorry, Councilor Marcello.
Thank you, Madam President. The Harbor Light project, what construction project are we talking about?
I don't have the particulars of it in front of me. I would have to pull that information after the meeting.
I don't know of any Harbor Light project that's near construction in Salem. Well, are these construction grants actual construction or planning?
Actual construction for hard costs.
So they would need to be expended by what date? Expended
by the end of 2026.
By the end of 2026.
Right.
Okay, and the CDC ones? What project?
Again, I apologize. I don't have the particulars in front of me. I can certainly get them and share them with the council.
Do you know, Dominic?
St. James and the and those are the 2. Yeah, those are the MROD projects.
Well, do we know that for a fact, or is it a different project?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful for us to have an actual project list and the amount allocated for who would have that info? Would it be David or?
I've got it. I just literally don't have it right here in front of me. I can absolutely get that.
So we'll circle back to that one. I think that's definitely, though, like a void that we're seeing of not knowing that information. Councilor Varela?
Thank you, President Stott. Since you're on the subject of the allocations, how much money has been spent on the food security? And I believe that's the line item for $690,105.
Right. We have, within the food security bucket, we have spent about $365,000. Some unspent funds in there. We are still, we allocated some money for kitchen improvements at the Community Life Center. That project is still kind of trying to get off the runway a little bit. We have some additional funds that we have allocated for the Salem Pantry, which we have not cut that check to them yet. But so those are two that are ongoing that have not been spent yet.
Thank you.
Councillor Hopworth?
Thank you, President Stott. So on the mobility side, we had funds allocated as like $1 million towards Salem Skipper, and then a chunk to Blue Bikes. I don't know what that amount was.
Blue Bikes expansion was for $375,000, and we have spent to date about $300,000 of that.
Okay. And I think we all love those programs. I love those programs. I guess my concern there, I guess just expressing a concern, is that that's potentially short term. Like, we'll enjoy those while that's happening, and then we get to worry about, I guess, what's next with those programs, and they could be temporary. Hopefully not, but they could be. Has there been discussion about some of the multi-use paths in Salem and connecting those? We still can't get our kids around the city safely on bikes. There's still chunks that are disconnected. Is that part of the plan? I think I asked that question last time. Has that been under discussion?
Sure. So two things. Going back to your first point about the Blue Bikes operations, we have structured that funding to be phased in over time. So in the first year, the ARPA allocation will cover 75% of the new operating costs. In the second year, it'll be 50%. In the third year, it'll be 25%. So the Traffic and Parking Department budget will be reflective of filling that gap in over time, so that it's not a shock to the budget when the ARPA funds go away, to avoid that kind of fiscal cliff issue. In terms of specific bike projects, another allocation within the transportation mobility bucket is $50,000 for bike master plan implementation. So those are funds directly overseen by the Traffic and Parking Department, again, to actually implement the city's bike master plan. They've spent to date just under that $50,000 allocation. So those are the funds that are most directly looking at kind of some of the bike connectivity issues that you mentioned there, and that's being, again, kind of led by Dave Kaczarski's team.
Is there potentially money that will be spent on the actual hard costs of, I think we all, I mean, obviously there's planning that needs to go into this, but we all know the sections that are missing and what we need to do. Is there potentially going to be money that'll be allocated towards the actual construction of connecting these to each other?
There's not right now. There certainly could be, and that's something that could be a decision that's made kind of when we do our kind of assessment and everything in the middle of the year, in terms of kind of what funds become available and what allocations get made. Right now, there's not a specific project about kind of doing the actual physical bike project connections that you're discussing.
Okay. And there's additional $5 million that has not been allocated. Is that correct?
About little 4.5 to 5, somewhere in that right now. And again, I expect that number will increase when we do our assessment in the middle of the year.
Okay. And I guess just the last question is around the funding for housing, the Life Bridge project specifically. What happens if that? I feel like in my mind, we're in the very early stages of that discussion. And that's certainly what I'm telling residents, is that we're still very early in this conversation, and this is, this could change, this could shift over time. What happens to those funds if that project changes substantially, or it gets delayed, or it doesn't happen? I guess there seems to be, to me it seems to be an odd thing that these funds are connected to that project right now, and we seem to be so early in those stages.
Right. So again, that part of the reason why those funds haven't been expended yet is because there was a lengthy back and forth with their legal team and ours. We landed on an agreement that includes a clawback for the city if we get to a point where those funds haven't been expended and we need to reallocate them. So the city has the ability to get that money back. And that's kind of what we landed on in terms of what we felt comfortable with in terms of making that agreement. It could mean that changes the potential of that program going forward. But we felt that we needed to kind of protect the city's financial interests since we're giving a significant amount of money out, but at the same time, still make sure that if the project does not happen on the timeline that we think it could, that we can still have time to get that money back to the city and then reallocate it.
Can we, when we get the list of the projects, could we get some details on what that clawback looks like and what the timelines look like? Is that something that's available?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm definitely curious about that because we're already, I feel, up against a clock. So if we're then going to wait another 2 years for a clawback, that makes me nervous. Councilor Merkel, and let the record reflect that Councilor Dominguez joined.
Thank you, President Stott. Yeah, along those lines, because that's actually was going to be my question, and to elaborate on that, what happens if, I understand the concept that we can claw back some of the funds if they're not making the deadline, but just to pick one of the projects as random, like the Willows Pier. So if we allocate the funds and they're halfway through the project, and then the deadline passes, then the city has to come up with those funds because we can't use them. I mean, just so I have an understanding of this, the hard deadline here of December 31st, 2026. So how does that play out? So let's say they're 3/4 through it and they bill 3/4 of that work by 2026 and we can use those funds, and then that literally ends, and then the city, we have to come up with some other resources to finish a project that is kind of halfway done before and then goes after.
Right. So it's two different things. So there's a difference, I think, between a project like the Willows Pier, which is a city project, and the housing construction grants, where we are giving funds to someone else to do that project entirely, and that's part of their funding source for that project. The Willows Pier project is one where lots of city departments are involved in that. And with that, and with every project, we have tried to kind of find that balance between allocating funds for projects that we feel confident will meet those timelines and those that won't. There's no guarantee. Lots of things can happen, but we feel confident with the allocations that we've made that there's a very high likelihood that we won't run into that issue that you mentioned. We can't predict the future, we can't know for sure, but we've been careful about how we've made those decisions in terms of which projects are receiving ARPA funding, knowing that there is that deadline, there's that hard deadline that we cannot go past.
Okay, so I have the correct understanding. They are hard deadlines, so we're looking at, trying to make sure they're projects that will be completed. Okay, thank you.
And Councilor Cohen?
Thank you, President Stott. So I have a number of concerns. I'm going to start with understanding the clawback and the process, which I'm comfortable with. The first is I believe there's a big difference right now regarding the ADU support grants between the quality of the incentives, which are terrific, and the ability for people to implement them. I'll give you some examples. I'm trying to do one. It's been 6 months. I have a multifamily. 3 units or more is beyond confusing and cumbersome. One of the reasons that we are doing this program is to encourage people with multifamilies. The planning department is trying to develop a one sheet so that people who are interested in doing this can figure out what they need to do to go forward. And obviously right now we've had very few people even apply for it. Never mind. And not only am I facing a lot of obstacles, but I do know someone else who's trying to do it who's facing different obstacles. So I'm just concerned on that project that we will get anywhere close to where we forecasted. Number 2, you have listed expansion of the urban tree program. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me because a good part of Ward 5 is included in the tree program, but many people have asked who are not in the original radius if they could get a tree or trees, and they've been told no. So unless you have other information, I don't understand how that program has been expanded at all.
I don't have other information on that, but I can certainly, if you can, I don't know if you can tell me offline or after the meeting or in the meeting.
So I'll just say right now, so the way the program exists is you go and you put in your address and it tells you if you're in the program or not. And there's been a lot of people who have been like literally on the border of the program. The first parts of it were the point, because the program is basically for lower income areas that have deficiency in tree canopy. So, the point and then a little bit outside the point were like the first ones they were promoting, but there are people a little bit outside the border who have tried to be included or not. So I don't know exactly what expansion means, but if it's expansion of the radius, that doesn't seem to be happening. I do feel like a lot of people would participate in the program. People, I know even in Councilor Stott's ward, who would like to be in the program but were not in the original radius, for example. And if there is an expansion and they promote that, I think a lot of people would participate that and we could spend the money fairly quickly. I do want to address the Palmer Cove Phase 2. Everything seems positive in that phase except the conversion of the baseball field. There is a huge disconnect between the Planning Department, Park and Rec, and interested parties. And this is really important because there's been, over a series of time, many years, there have been a series of working group meetings. And unfortunately, some of the people who reside in the neighborhood, so the park is actually in Ward 5, which has a little bit of the point, but a lot of people who live in the point, have a lot of interest in that baseball field. And we're, in some cases, not even made aware of the working group meetings and feel like, I know this is more of a political thing, unless for you, Nick, but I'm expressing this, that my personal opinion would be that that one particular component of that Phase 2 be delayed until there's a better meeting of the minds with the neighborhood. It's become very contentious. People in the neighborhood, I'm expressing this because of everyone who's in the room. It's become very contentious because the neighborhood in general feels like a decision was made and they weren't consulted or included in the process, and that, too bad for you, it's going forward. You can appeal the decision to Park and Rec. So the fact that it's still listed on your itinerary here is troubling to me, because I would really like to see this to be more of a community participation decision. It doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. I know it does save money not to have a baseball field and have more of a multi-use field, but this field has been used for particular reasons by people in the neighborhood and beyond for a long time, and it's a very cultural thing. So I just want to express that, because I'd be much more comfortable if that comes back to the council, expending that money if there's a little bit better resolution, okay? My last thing is, and I do very much appreciate after the budget retreat, being able to meet with you and Mr. Rodriguez about some of the concerns I had about sustainability, and for people, because it was just the three of us, some of the concepts I had about being able to spend money that could be sustainable, not just from an environmental standpoint, but financially, where we could invest money, for example, in solar panels, and the return on investment could be anywhere from 300 to 10,000%. It cannot be spent under the guidelines of ARPA. But I'm just going to throw this out, not that it's something that I would expect you to pursue or the city to pursue, but do you know if we can spend ARPA money purchasing land on behalf of the city? Or can you find that out?
I can certainly look into that. At first blush, my gut would tell me that I can tell you with a fair bit of certainty that there is not kind of an eligible use category for the purchase of land. It could potentially be funded through the revenue loss category, but I cannot speak to the legal implications, ramifications, all of that would need to get sorted out if the city were to pursue something like
So
that.
I'm not
That's beyond my
expecting an
ken.
answer, but maybe something that when you and David are talking, you could think about this. I'll give you an example. Grief, the recycling plant is not operational. I'm assuming it's being sold. The engineering department has come to us and talked about the need for a new DPS facility, needs more land. It's ironically adjacent. It already has capacity to do a lot of the things that we have talked about as a city, to be able to maybe process composting or styrofoam, or, you know, it's currently able to process paper and other things. We don't have an ability for businesses or residents to process, to recycle bulk cardboard right now, for example. And I'm just throwing this out there, it just came to me like, if we could purchase that land at a reasonable price, it may be also, in addition to something short-term, might be something long-term in the pursuit of land, because at least Councilor Varela and I talked to the city engineer, and there's been a struggle to find the requisite amount of land that we need to have a new DPS. And that might actually accomplish that as well. So just a thought, and thank you.
Thank you. My colleagues have shared with me the specific clawback language. I'm happy to kind of read it into the record, such as it is tonight, and then I can send it to you all via email afterward. But in terms of the clawback language for those housing construction grants that we mentioned, recipient shall commence work being funded under this grant award no later than June 30th, 2024, and complete all work being funded under the program by December 31st, 2026. In the event that work is not commenced by June 30th, 2024, the city, at its sole discretion, may require by written notice to the recipient that all grant funds be returned to the city of Salem. So that is the specific language that's in all of the terms and conditions and contracts with those entities receiving funds through the Affordable Housing Construction Grant Program. And as I mentioned, I'll get that in writing to you all after the meeting.
Thank you. Was there a date in there?
Yes, so if work is not, in the event that work is not commenced by June 30th, 2024.
Okay, and we have until 2026 to
Right, so
spend?
the idea would be that upon receiving the funds, they'll have just over a year between when funds actually go out the door to actually get work started. And if they have not by June 30th, 2024, then the city can, by written notice to them, require that the funds be returned.
And then that gives us a year and a half to figure out what to do with the
That
money.
would give us about 6 months to figure it out and about 2.5 to spend it.
Okay. Can I just follow up with a few points that Councilor Cohen asked? For the AADU program grant funding, you mentioned a number at the beginning. How much have we allocated towards that program? Do you know?
We allocated $1 million toward the ADU program. And as I mentioned, we've had 2 design grants come through, 1 construction grant, and I believe we have 1 construction grant that we're currently doing the paperwork on right now. So the construction grants are for up to $45,000, and the design grants are for up to $2,500.
So about 100,000
Just about, yeah.
spent so far.
The design grant is 50% of the design. So if it's 5,000, you can get, if it's.
Okay, yeah, I was just curious how much has been spent so far.
Yeah, up to 50%, but it is capped.
Thank you.
Right.
And then with the tree canopy question, it sounds to me like the expansion that the city is paying for is not part of the Mass DCR Urban Canopy Program, which that's the website that if somebody goes in, their guideline, their borders are not going to change. So it has to be a see-click fix, which is, as somebody that doesn't have any DCR in my ward, I know that I don't send anybody to that website because it's going to say it doesn't work, but to enter a see-click fix to get a tree. And I have been seeing those as being responsive, but perhaps we can add some additional communication around that like, hey, you know, in the past, if you've asked for this, or even, I know I've been asked by like Katie and Ray, hey, where do you need trees? And, you know, I need to hear about them to then advocate for it, but anyone can enter a see-click fix to allocate or to access that additional tree canopy fund. I just wanted to make that noted. I think that was it for me, sorry. Councilor Merkel, or Marcillo, sorry.
Can you just tell me the end date for the clawback? And that is did you say the construction has to be completed by?
So yes, so work needs to be commenced no later than June 30th, 2024. And then all work must be complete by December 31st, 2026. So if they have not begun work by June of next year, by June 30th of next year, that would be the timeline at which the city could then begin the process to claw back the money.
And this is hard construction?
Hard cost, yes.
Like a shovel in the ground construction?
Yes, absolutely. Another kind of hard cost associated with it, but not related to the planning piece of it.
Do you have the amounts that have been given to the different organizations?
So the original pot of money for affordable housing was $5 million total. As I mentioned, we directed a portion of that to a project at Plummer Youth Promise that I believe, I don't know why my presentation keeps shutting off, sorry about that, that I believe was in the amount of around $430,000. So that left us with $4.67 million, and we divided that essentially into 3 awards of 1.4, and then my math is going to fail me there.
Okay.
But 1.4 and a little bit more to each of those three projects, which we'll get you additional information on. 1.142.
You said there's 3 projects. Motion CDC, Harbor Light, and
Crescent Lot.
Crescent Lot, yeah.
Councilor Merkel?
Thank you, President Stott, and thank you for all the great information. One quick point I would like to elaborate on what Councilor Cohen said. I have been on several of the Point Neighborhood Association meetings, and they have expressed concern about not having a baseball field and would appreciate some more conversation on that. And also, I think when you were originally going over all the slides here, you mentioned when you have the allocations here and the grid of the categories. You had mentioned which is limited. Are there individual limits? Is that what you had said? I was trying to take the notes quickly, but are there individual limits for the categories?
No. So
Okay.
the limit that I mentioned was related to any spending that the city categorizes as revenue loss. So early on, there was the original proposal from the feds required us to do an incredibly complex and lengthy and time-consuming calculation to determine what the direct fiscal impact of the pandemic was on local receipts. I feel like it was about the day after Anna finished doing that math, they came out and said, actually, you can just say, you can use up to $10 million of your allocation, which we chose to do because it meant that we didn't have to make that calculation every year, and our local receipts recovered pretty quickly, so it made sense for us to instead of doing that math over and over again, to say, all right, we have accepted that going forward, our plan will spend no more than $10 million in the revenue loss category. So that's really the only categorical limitation, and that revenue loss spending can kind of happen across the categories on the pie chart there. So we always try with projects to slot them into an existing expense category as defined by the U.S. Treasury, that is the federal agency that runs ARPA, because we want to keep as much flexibility as possible with the dollars that we have as we get toward the end of the program. Because it's going to be easier to spend money that we can spend on anything, rather than if we've spent all of our revenue loss money, then we can only spend it in those categories defined by the feds. So we're trying to, anytime we can, whenever we get a project that comes in, we do everything that we can to look at all of the potential expense categories that are available and see if it can fit into one of those. And if not, and we still want to pursue funding for it, then it would be paid through the revenue loss category.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. That's what I had not picked up on in the original explanation. Thank you.
Councilor Dominguez?
Thank you, President Stott. I just quickly wanted to ask you in regard to this graph that you have right here, because to me it's a little bit confused on colors. I think that we need to make it bigger and brighter to differentiate some of the allocation because some of the color are kind of similar
Okay.
and too little to know. So you can make it bigger or maybe do it different in a way that everybody understands exactly what's going on. And secondly, and I'm sorry I'm late, I'm not able to discuss so many of the content and the conversation you might have tonight, but I just wanted to ask, maybe through you or through the chairman, to the new administration, because back in the last page you say that the public engagement meetings would be scheduled. Any idea what time frame do we have for that conversation to be taken over with the general public on the public hearings? Because according to what I read right here, it's not public hearing yet because I was holding and waiting on the new administration to take place. Any idea?
I expect that we would want kind of the new public engagement hearings to correlate with the look that we're going to be doing of what we've spent to date. So I don't know if that means we'll have a hearing in June or July, but I expect sometime in the next 2 months would be the first hearing for the year, and then another hearing at the end of the calendar year as well.
In that meeting, it's possible to include some type of translation?
We have done that, yes. So in all of our public engagement hearings to date, we've made sure to have live Spanish translation in the meetings. We've made sure that those were hybrid meetings that we've had, and I think we would continue to do that going forward. But that's one of the things that we've actually been lucky that we're able to do because we have a little bit more flexibility with some of the ARPA funds that we can spend. It's easier for us to have those translation services because we've got that built into our budget. Not all city departments have that yet, but we're a bit of a test case in that regard, kind of with our own little weird ARPA unit here. But it's worked really well for us so far, and that would be absolutely the plan going forward.
Yeah, also in the process of selecting the grant applications, there is any process that you can elaborate how you choose who are the one that apply? And I know so far I've seen in the past it's been a transparent process, but I just want to make sure that it is in place some type of mechanism that you will explain, and people will know exactly that everybody have equity on applying for and getting selected.
Absolutely. So for example, through the Festival and Special Event Support Program, that's a program that we ran last year and that we're running again this year. Those are funds for organizations that have special events here in the city. We made sure that information was posted on salem.com/recovery. We made sure to share that widely with counselors and other folks at the time to make sure that information and that application got out there. Then once folks actually apply, the process that we have set up internally, myself and my colleague Dave Rodriguez do kind of a first pass just to make sure that the application is complete and that we've got all the information that we need. If we feel like we're missing any information, we'll reach out to the applicant and ask for that. We will then, that process then goes through the mayor's office for approval. It then goes to a group of us to kind of look at for something that has a limited amount of funding. So for the Festival and Special Event Program, we actually, I think we maybe had to deny 1 or 2 of those applications, but for generally speaking, we were able to fund almost everything that came through. If we find ourselves kind of bumping up against what we have budgeted for a given program, we will have a discussion internally if we want to allocate additional funds for that. So that's what happened with the nonprofit assistance program that we ran. We had a $250,000 budget. We had 12 applications where everyone was asking for the max of $25,000. They were all great applications. We decided to actually up the allocation for that program so that we could fund all of those. But that's kind of the internal process that it goes through. So there's that first pass where we look at the application, make sure it's complete. There's a mayor's office approval. There's an approval then that comes through back to the ARPA team to actually figure out, to make sure that it fits into the funding parameters that we've set up, to make sure that in some instances the organizations that would be receiving funds meet the criteria that we've set. So they might need to be, in some instances, they need to be a registered nonprofit. That's not the case in every program that we've had, but that's generally the case with a lot of these assistance programs that we've done. They've been kind of focused on the nonprofit sector. and then make sure that we are kind of going through all of the kind of terms and conditions. So there's an agreement that they need to sign if they're going to get any funds. There is a certain amount of kind of post-event data collection that we do that we include in our report back to the federal government. And that's kind of the start to finish of how we've run it when we have those kind of what are technically competitive grant programs. So that's what we've done to make sure that that information gets out widely and then it goes through kind of different stages of kind of being vetted here internally.
My last question, if I may. The allocation on the funds on each category, it's been selected by your group, or it's been selected in general by a consensus of the whole administration? I mean, how is the process? How do you select, for example, how you allocate money on housing? I know there's a need. How you allocate, I mean, can you elaborate a little bit on how you do it?
Yeah, so it was, generally speaking, it was conversations with myself, my colleague Dave Rodriguez, Anna, the previous administration, in terms of kind of setting the big numbers in terms of, all right, we're going to spend $5 million on affordable housing, and then kind of trying to figure out the particulars of what gets funded kind of comes down from there. But the big picture is definitely something that has been set by the mayor's office. And then our job is kind of to craft programs that kind of fit within those parameters. And then sometimes, we'll have either counselors or members of the public reach out directly to us and express a need. We'll then look into it a little bit more to see if, we don't want to create 1,000 projects that are specifically tailored to really small individual things. If someone reaches out and we feel that there's a need, we'll try and craft a program that can fund that type of work in multiple different organizations. So sometimes that'll kind of go the opposite way, where folks will reach out to us, we'll determine that there is a need for this funding, we'll work on actually crafting a program that fits within our funding parameters and kind of the city's overall goals and strategies, and then kind of move that up to the mayor's office for approval at that point as well. So it can kind of, it's definitely a two-way street in terms of the overall goals and kind of the overall amounts in those categories. Certainly kind of comes from the mayor's office.
Thanks. And if my memory serves me correctly, there was like a lot of surveys done at the beginning with the public,
right.
And there was a big process
yeah, so early on, the process was very much focused on input from councils at the time, from residents, from community organizations. Mm-hmm. And what that really shaped was kind of the guiding principles for how we wanted to focus our ARPA spending. It was not a process by which we were asking for folks to give us kind of a menu of specific projects, but more, these are the needs that we all know exist. What are the types of projects that we could, or programs that we could create that would address those needs?
Could you explain for me how the school funding is related with this? I believe I heard that they received some I heard they received some emergency funding as well, but it's called something different. It's not called ARPA, because I see like the mental health funding that we're getting, and I know that like the Cartwheel app and the additional funding for the schools, like that, if we could pour any extra into there, like I know that would be spent in a second. So I'm curious what and I know it's not your department, but how those kind of connect with each other, and are we allowed to do any spending with the schools or programs for children in the city? Right,
so it does fall outside of my purview. There's nothing that would prevent us necessarily from doing that, but the schools have their own allocations and their own process about how they've made the determinations for how they want to spend the monies they've received, and that has fallen outside of the process that I've been directly involved.
Sure, thanks. And I will also note that the mayor-elect, Pangallo, has joined us this evening. I don't know if he wanted to speak to any of this, or if you're kind of pointing at each other.
Yeah, I think Anna Friedman can answer your most recent question, so
okay.
I think she might come up.
Awesome, thank you. And Mayor-elect, if there's anything that you want to add during this, let me know.
Great question on the school funding. So the school received their own, as Nick noted, set of federal dollars called ESSER. And I was looking up to remind myself what that acronym is, and it's Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief. It's been distributed in 3 tranches, I believe. The ESSER funds do roll off sooner than the ARPA funds. So I believe that the deadline for the 3rd tranche, and I would like to caveat this with, I would want to double check this, but I believe that needs to be The spending deadline is September of 2024. So there's, those roll up sooner than the ARPA funds. It has been, those funds are within the purview of the school district to spend, and so there hasn't really been overlap with the ARPA funds. However, through the capital plan in particular, if the school has had projects that may or may not fit within their funding, that's been evaluated as part of the overall capital planning exercise and determining what funding sources might be appropriate. Does that?
Can I ask another question kind of along those lines? So say like projects come back and we're not able to fund housing and we're up against the wire. Are the buckets that we're in, are we locked into those buckets that we chose where we said like 10 million for this and only 1 million for mental health? We can switch it and say.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
We can absolutely move those around. So those are not hard and fast. Again, the only categorical limitation is what I mentioned earlier to Councilor Merkel, that revenue loss piece. Other than that, everything else can be moved around so that if we find ourselves really up against the deadline, you know, a lot of water and sewer infrastructure projects are eligible through ARPA, and if we find ourselves with not a lot of time, we know that there are needs there, and that's one that we know we can spend ARPA money that's ARPA eligible on things like that. So in terms of the other buckets, those can all be moved and shifted as needed as we kind of get closer to the deadline and projects either come online or come offline or come in under budget or things like that, and things need to get reallocated.
Okay, thank you. I think Councilor Cohen and then Councilor Marcillo.
Thank you, President Stott. So my comment question relates to the last discussion. I'm personally very comfortable with the way the process has gone. I think this is a lot of money, and having it centralized through the mayor's office is really the best way to, most productive way to do it. My concern is that we spend all the available money. I do feel like, you know, in the beginning there was urgency because of the pandemic, and then I think really the next batch of money was focused on housing stabilization and rent relief and even mortgage stuff, so that I think that's really positive. My question is, and I'm assuming you're already doing this, that you're developing a list. You know, for example, I know that when the pantry got money, there were other entities that had applied for that money and didn't get it, that you have a list with amounts that if money is clawed back, that you can rapidly, you know, reallocate the money so that we can make sure that we hit our 35 million.
I feel confident that when we begin that process of kind of assessing everything and determining what is available still left to reallocate and spend, I'm confident that we're going to spend every penny of this. It's something that I personally and Dave Rodriguez and I think everyone who's been working on this is committed to. You know, again, we're not going to get this level of support from the federal government in a direct way probably any other time in the rest of our lifetimes. And there are a lot of opportunities that come with that, and I feel confident that we can get this money out the door.
As intended, right?
As intended.
Councilor Marcillo?
Thank you. So help me, as a counselor, keep tabs on when that date is, that drop dead date for when you're going to know if money's being clawed back and needs to be reassigned. What would that date be?
Okay, so the specific clawback for the housing construction grants is June 30th, 2024, so June of next year. But we're going to begin our process of looking at all of the allocations that have been made to date this July. So the beginning of the fiscal year, we're going to look at everything. And in many instances, those aren't instances in which a clawback is going to be necessary, because the allocations that have been made doesn't mean that money has actually gone out the door. It means that we previously said we will spend X number of dollars in this area. We spent less than that, so we now bring that kind of back into the central fund and then determine how that gets reallocated. So that process begins this July. The clawback on housing would be if work has not commenced on those projects by June 30th of 2024.
Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to do is, in order to use this for water and sewer projects, which I have 2 in my ward that I'm very keen on getting them started, and this would be a huge help, they would have to have the project ready to go, right? Like, they would have to be able to use it very quickly. So that's why I'm trying to figure out, like, what date are we targeting for when we know we need to reallocate these funds quickly so that we
Right.
spend every single penny?
Yep, so we, all funds across the board, all of ARPA, has to be allocated by the end of 2024.
So by December 31st, 2024,
We have made all of our decisions.
you guys will know exactly what's where, what's going to be spent, what hasn't been spent, and, okay.
Exactly.
So that's when we get another update from you to say, this is what we have left, and this is what we're thinking.
So the update on December 31st, 2024 would be, we have allocated every penny of our funds, the money is out the door.
Okay, so then let's work back. So then are you telling me it's just kind of a moving date that you know that money isn't, it's just not working, whatever that project
so
is?
it's 3 different dates.
Okay.
The first that's coming up is going to be July 1st, when we begin looking at all of our current funding and saying, all right, what's going to kind of come back from what we previously allocated and be reallocated in a different way. That process is going to begin this July. The next date is June 30th, 2024, which is the clawback date for the housing construction grants. The other date after that is December 31st, 2024. By December 31st, 2024, the city needs to have allocated all of our ARPA funds. And we won't get a chance after that, if a project doesn't get completed by the end of 2026, we won't get another chance to reallocate that.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah.
That's clear.
So it's not, they're not moving dates necessarily, but they are fluid in terms of kind of, the July 1st one is one internally for us. That's not one that that anyone else has set. We just think that's the fiscally responsible thing to do, to begin that process now, so that we're not really rushing at the end of 2024 to make decisions.
Agreed.
When we say allocated, I believe under the federal rule, it has to basically be encumbered, like physically encumbered in the accounting system. And so like those projects are locked in, underway, and it's just that it's in the process of being spent down. And so when we say allocated, it not just from a planning perspective, but literally, money's like out the door, allocated, and it's just being spent down.
Okay. Which underscores the fact that if we are going to use it on water and sewer projects, they need to be like in the position where they're ready to go, right?
Yeah, and then they would, if the money is physically appropriated and is being spent down at that point, it just would need to be spent down by the deadline in 2026.
2026.
So they'd have
Okay.
that time to actually complete the project.
Yeah, okay, got it. Can you give a little bit of information on what was spent in the general government spending category?
Sure, give me one moment here. So that included, whenever we have funded capital projects through ARPA, that fell under kind of the general government spending, so that did fall under kind of the revenue loss. Off the top of my head, I don't know what what we funded in the FY23 CIP. I would need to go back and look at that, but we have, beginning in FY22, we've started listing ARPA as one of the funding sources in the capital plan. So generally speaking, when capital projects were funded, they fell under that kind of general government spending. We allocated some funds for our 311 operators, a stipend for those employees. We allocated some money for IT cybersecurity improvements, for the public health vending machines that are here in City Hall and in the City Hall Annex. Funds for Rahina to conduct a citywide equity audit, and then also funding for some new HVAC units potentially at the police department, where they've had some significant issues with their old HVAC system. That fell under that, again, kind of that capital side of things.
Okay, thank you.
I feel like I missed one of those, the 311 services, the healthcare vending machine.
311 services, generally when we've funded capital projects through ARPA, it falls under that category.
Okay.
I could pull that list for FY23. I don't know off the top of my head which projects we did fund. And then we'd have some more kind of upcoming in the FY24 capital plan as well. Cybersecurity improvements, funds for an equity audit, and funds for improved rooftop HVAC at the police department.
Anyone else? We do not have any members of the public joining us remotely or on Zoom. If there are any members in the chamber that would like to come up or... Please state your name and address for the record.
I don't have to do that. Thanks for the opportunity to be up here. So yeah, just to... Oh, really? Yeah. My name is Dominic Pangallo. My address is 25 Buffalo Street. So yeah, the tree funding, as you mentioned, is a supplement so that the parts of the city that are outside of the DCR's designated planting zone would also have the ability to access trees. Unlike the Greening the Gateway Cities program, though, that funding can only be used for trees on public property. We can't plant trees on private property like they can in the Greening the Gateway City program areas. The allocations, they were developed not with saying like we want to spend X million on this category, but it was, build the program, fund it, and it's kind of broken down in that way right now, which is why you see those pie shapes. Like some of them are very, very specific numbers because it was related to very specific costs. And then just lastly to the clawback thing, there's no shortage of needs. We do have the ability to use ARPA funds on certain city infrastructure projects that aren't related to construction, though. So unlike the housing things, like if it's a design-related cost, the city can also use ARPA for that. So I'm confident that whatever comes back or whatever's unspent by the end of the period, we'll find Dave Knowlton sneezes in millions of dollars quantities. So there is no shortage of, I think, things that are, if not shovel-ready, design-ready, or in need of funds for design phase and engineering. So, and like you said, Councilor, I think water and sewer, just initially feels like it's the right fit because it also gives us the ability to maybe make a positive difference in the water sewer rates down the road. So we're not only completing essential projects for the infrastructure of our community, but we're also hopefully saving people a little bit of money down the road and investing in those kinds of one-time capital needs. So, and lastly, just the topic of the public meeting. Yeah, we'll absolutely have additional public meetings and get through this budget process, kind of get my feet under me, but I think this is important and I want to restart those and kind of get some more public feedback about the future direction of how we're directing these funds. So.
Do we have any questions? Councilor Varela?
Thank you, President. Through you to Mayor-elect Pangallo. So concerning just the allocations and going forward, I do hope that when you guys look into spending this other sum of money, that you guys take in mind that I know we do have a lot of contracted services here, and I do believe there's a way, like Councilor Cohen said, when it comes to being resilient on our own as a city, by actually making revenue by some of these acts, just like composting, styrofoam, recycling in general. I think that there's an opportunity here to make revenue for our city and not just spend the money. So I hope that when you guys are looking at this plan, that we look to the future, that we're mindful about that, not only with food security. If we have land that's available, we should also be emphasizing how do we make money off that as well for our residents. So I hope that you guys are looking into that. Thank you.
Councilor Marcillo?
Thank you. I don't know who can answer this, but one thing that I'm wondering is if anything has been allocated for our older population as far as the homebound who have been really impacted by the pandemic, and trying to get them mental health services and any supports that they need. It feels like it's a very disjointed connection between the city and our homebound seniors. I think that we have a lot of work to do in that department. And I'm not sure that the Council on Aging is necessarily making great inroads in that area, but I know that there's a need there, and I don't know if I see anything that addresses that in the list.
I mean, there hasn't been to date, but noted, we can talk about it with Terry and the team of the social workers down there and see what they think might be a good model for something that would work. that we might be able to use for that. My only hesitation is creating a program that isn't sustainable in the long run. You know, like I wouldn't want to create something that people would come to depend on, and then not have a plan for it going forward. And if it's a program that works and people depend on, then, you know, we find a way to phase it into the budget, you know, like we're doing with Blue Bikes. But I would hate to create something that then we're kind of scrambling to either take away or increase, you know, the amount we're spending on something. So,
yeah, I think like as Councilor Councilor Stott pointed out, apologies. The mental health services that were started at the schools.
Yeah, the Cartwheel program.
Yeah, the Cartwheel program was a huge need, and obviously it's oversubscribed. But that kind of a service for our elders is, I think, really needed, and I don't know if we've done anything like that yet. Yeah.
Noted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Just to kind of piggy off of that, I will note that infrastructure and sewer projects, like I think all of us ward counselors could quickly name off 3 or 4 that are needed, but the use for this money was I think really should be allocated towards the pandemic recovery and those that were hit the hardest. So the mental health services or industries or that were in the city, like I feel like those are the smallest slices here. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to be shuffling things around, we should be looking into how do we get back to that, and was there other space that could be filled up? Just
yeah,
kind of
absolutely. Point. Yeah, I hear that. I think there's also a lot of our water sewer projects aren't just about providing a municipal service. There's resiliency aspects. There's aspects where some of our most disadvantaged communities and populations are negatively impacted by the poor service or by the risk of a failure of a system. So there is that aspect to it. That it's not just about recovery from COVID, but like strengthening the community for whatever's going to come down the road as well. So, but trying to balance those two needs for sure.
Councilor Dominguez.
Thank you, President Starr. My comment was kind of related to what Councilor Monticello just said, but I see on the graph some allocation for COVID response, and according to the news, the COVID is already over. So what is this allocation is for, and can we use some of this money to some of the programs that we just mentioned, elderly, but I also wanted to add the homeless population, which are very growing here in Salem. So that allocation can be diverted to those type of programs.
Yeah, I'll let Nick talk about so there's 2 lines that you're looking at in the chart. There's the Pandemic Emergency Response Reserve, which we touched on a little bit earlier, and the Direct Pandemic Response and Public Health, which is, I think, costs that have already been expended early on during some of the worst times, like the height of the pandemic. But I'll let, if you want to outline what those are.
Right, that's correct. So there was the money that the city spent directly on pandemic response and recovery. So things like testing clinics and vaccine clinics and at-home tests and other items like that. And that falls under that kind of direct pandemic response. The Pandemic Emergency Reserve is that $3.5 million that we early on decided to kind of set aside in case there was another major outbreak that the city was going to have to respond to. Because there has not been to date, that's going to be, I think, one of the first places that we will begin to have our conversations this July around reallocating of those funds. So that's $3.5 million, a full 10% of the allocation that we received. I think we will bring that number down significantly. I can't say exactly how much. If we'll want to keep some small portion of that still going forward, but that is certainly some of the money that will be kind of reallocated as we move forward. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep. Feel free.
Sorry, so I just wanted to. So there was an allocation of $250,000 for a mental health access grant program, which would be, I think, related to the question about mental health needs. None of it's been spent yet. I think that was a program that was developed conceptually, but there was no application for it.
We've got some of it out the door.
Okay.
It's not fully expended. So.
I'll let you go.
it doesn't fully hit on what you were mentioning about kind of the homebound population, but I think it's certainly a model that we could use as a program for something that was more specifically geared toward that population.
Are those grants, correct?
Right.
Yeah. Anyone else? Councilor Varela?
I'm assuming you're looking for a motion, President Stott?
If we're,
I think I make a motion that this matter remain in committee.
Councilor Varela moves that this matter remain in committee. Seconded by Councilor Dominguez. And we will file the presentation as well. I am not doing these minutes later. On Councilor Varela's motion that this matter remains in committee, any further discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? Matter remains in committee. Okay, thank you. Councilor Cohen?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Anna, Nick, David, and Mayor-elect, and I move that we adjourn.
Councilor Cohen moves that we adjourn, seconded by Councilor Varela. All those in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you. And thank you. Thank you, Nick, Anna, for your information. And David, even though he's not here, I'm sure he had some insight as well.
I'm going to take all of Dave's credit.
Thank you.